Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody tuning in for today's discussion on year four in Ukraine, views on the impact of Russia's war of aggression on the Middle East. I'm Dana Stroul, Research Director and the Casson Family Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I will serve as moderator for today's panel and discussion. And this discussion could not be more timely given the statement issued only a few hours ago from Secretary Rubio on where Russia and the United States agreed to cooperate in a meeting hosted in Saudi Arabia and facilitated by Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan. It marks a new phase in the U.S. approach to the Russia-Ukraine war and is the first high-level effort to broker an end to Russia's war of aggression and full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It also marks a shift from the policy approach of the Biden administration, which emphasized cooperation with allies and partners, especially in Europe, to isolate and impose costs on Russia for the invasion, and maintained commitment to no talks about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine. For the past 3 years, the governments of the Middle East have resisted completely aligning themselves with the US-led coalition in support of Ukraine and maintained ties to and cooperation with Russia. Now, with a new approach coming from Washington, there are important insights to be gleaned about the approach of the Middle East toward this war, as well as key questions about the future of the Middle East with respect to Russia, Ukraine, and this changing US role. To answer these questions, we have assembled a fantastic panel today. Anna Borshchevskaya is the Harold Grinspoon Senior Fellow in our Glaser Foundation program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East, specializing in Russia's policy toward the region. Javier Colomina is the NATO Secretary General's Special Representative for the Southern Neighborhood, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy. Riad Kahwaji is a security and defense consultant based in Dubai. He founded Enigma in 2001, a defense and security think tank that is well known here in Washington, D.C. It is based in Dubai, and he is a military security affairs analyst and commentator. Before we dive into today's discussion, a few housekeeping notes. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, you can enter them into the Zoom question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Thank you again to our exceptional panel for lending your time and expertise today. What I'd like to do is invite each of you to share a few thoughts reflecting on the impact of 3 years of the Russia-Ukraine war on the Middle East and what the last few days of developments and today mean for this region. Anna, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Dana. It's a pleasure to be with you today to have this very important conversation. I'd like to begin by way of introduction by making 3 points. First, Russia sees as its mission to change the world order, to dominate the world order. That's what this war was about. Second, throughout the course of this war, it became clear that American allies and partners, and more broadly Western allies and partners in the region, had divergent priorities from the West when it came to understanding this war, and sometimes did fail to appreciate Russia's purpose. And then third and finally, this is not a war that Ukraine or the West can lose without a great peril to all. So let me briefly explain each one of these points. First and foremost, Vladimir Putin cast this war as being about the West. When he invaded Ukraine, this was an act of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful neighbor. He claimed that the West was using Ukraine to weaken Russia. In other words, the war was taking place in Ukraine, but really this was about the West. what Putin was trying to do was challenge the liberal global order set up by the United States at the end of World War II, and in particular, the European post-Cold War security architecture. He was looking to replace it with an alternative vision of what Russian officials call a multipolar or polycentric world, where the world is divided into great powers, and these great powers have a privileged sphere of influence where they can act with impunity. Russia at its core is an empire, and it was acting as one. Second, how did our Middle East partners fit into this picture? As I mentioned, they had a divergent view of this war and of Russia's purpose. And the region responded with a combination of actions. But if we were to draw a few conclusions, first, many did not see the global dimension of this war and focused on it through a prism of their own interests. To be sure, many condemned Russia, many condemned the war, but also refused to condemn Russia directly, nor did they join Western sanctions. Many also focused on expanding commercial interests with Russia. And this is a very important point of discussion because here Russia was able to find a resource lifeline to continue to fund its war on Ukraine. Many also simply saw this as a battle between a larger battle between the United States and Russia that they wanted to stay out of. But Russia, for its part, moved closer to American adversaries in the region and helped fuel chaos across the Middle East to help divert Western attention from Ukraine and to force the United States to expand more of its resources. Finally, this war is not a war Ukraine or the West can lose to a great peril to all. What do I mean by that? This is a global battle for Russia, and the Middle East became a critical arena of this global competition. Russia actively used this region as an arena of this competition. It actively undermined US interests with the aim of achieving this bigger strategic objective. This region is so important because to win in Ukraine, the West understood as the war progressed, the West had to go outside Ukraine. Certainly Russia had gone outside Ukraine to win this war. And it is here that Russia finds resources to fund its war effort. And let me conclude on the last note by saying a few words about Ukrainians, because their view is so important as part of this discussion. Ukrainians, for their part, understood that they were late in the game in terms of winning the hearts and minds of this region, because here Russian narratives have already resonated prominently. But the message that they often have is that Russia's vision of a multipolar world is ultimately a losing one. And if the world embraces that vision, it will not bring prosperity to anyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Riad, can I turn to you next? You're on mute.
Yeah. All right. You hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. The war in Ukraine did have a big impact on the Middle East from the very start. The main reason is that the Middle East relied heavily on the grains from both places, Ukraine or Russia. So the economic impact along also with the oil, the impact on the oil prices. So the economic factors weighed in from day one, and but in turn impacted the political stance of in the region here. We traditionally have countries that have always had good relations, strategic relations with Russia, even from the time of the Soviet Union. Talking here about countries like Algeria, like Egypt. Have the countries that be natural allies of the West, especially in the Gulf region. But in this case here, the war happened at the time of the Biden administration, experiencing some political difficulties with countries in the Gulf, Saudi, UAE, of the history dating from the Obama administration, reaching that particular date, the issue of the Biden administration holding the F-35 deal for the UAE, which also impacted the political atmosphere here. And also came at a time that these countries were developing their foreign policy in a way that they utilize soft power and maintain neutrality in the great power competition. And that was also practiced in reaction to the events on the Ukraine-Russia theater of operations. Now, as the situation progressed, and Russia started to use and utilize its relations in the Middle East, things started taking a different shape. Meaning here, the main partner that Russia sought to assist it in the war effort was Iran. And with the more it utilized its relations with Iran, especially in getting ballistic missiles, getting the drones, and also Iran lost its main ally in the JCPOA talks. And this did eventually impact Iran's situation, or the so-called the acts of resistance. And then the October 7 attacks happened in Gaza, and we saw how that negatively impacted the Iran proxies, and how things unfolded, where we today see Iran has lost its main proxies, Hezbollah. It lost Syria, which was also Russia's main trophy from the period between 2011, or in the post-Arab Spring period. Russia came out with a big gain in Syria, where it had established itself in strength, managed to get a deal to have two bases, a naval base and an air base, right down at the southern front of NATO. And all of a sudden now, with the progress of the war, and as a result of its policy with Iran to assist the war effort in Ukraine, we saw the end game impacting Russia's influence in the region in a negative manner, if you're looking at the strategic output of the whole thing here into perspective. But again, in general, the mood in the Middle East in general did actually side with Russia's point of view on the war in Ukraine. Many had felt that Russia was dragged into this war because of NATO growing more and more towards the east and reaching Russia's borders. So that narrative did actually sell very well. However, even though this in the media this was a strong feeling, however, the countries in their policies, they tried to maintain neutrality. And that was clear in the votings, for example, at the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly. We saw how the Arab countries tried to balance their positions in a way not to upset the West, but at the same time to not to anger or distance themselves from the Russians. Also, we have to remember that there are strong economic interests that group the Gulf countries with Russia, and that is the OPEC plus. The countries here wanted to keep the oil prices at a certain level, not to adhere or succumb to the pressure from the West to increase the output, to bring down the prices in a way to that would affect Russia's negatively. So we see here that the economic interests in the region did not sync in well with the objectives of the West. So all of this has impacted the region in a way that on the one side, we see the political stance try to stay neutral, not to distance themselves from Russia, but at the same time, Russia's strong dependence on its allies in the region, especially Iran, has ended up with sinking Iran and getting itself kicked out, or more or less, its position undermined in one of its main gains, which is Syria. And we see now the repositioning geopolitically towards North Africa and Libya in particular. Finally, the last point, also one of the impacts of this war was the defense relations of Russia with its partners in the region, talking here about Algeria, Egypt, which they had to cancel major defense contracts and seek substitute alternatives in the West because Russia was no longer able to fulfill their contracts. And this also another loss to Russia as a result of the war on Ukraine.
Thank you so much, especially your points on this desire for neutrality and broadly the notion of strategic or great power competition in the Middle East, and this tension between what you observed about countries and societies in the Middle East siding with or buying into the narrative through a Russian lens that NATO expansion is what forced Russia into a position of invading Ukraine. But on the other hand, this tension with Russia being on its back foot because of developments in Syria and its deepening relationship with Iran. So much to discuss there. Javier, may I turn to you now to provide the NATO and European perspective on 3 years of this war, its impact on the Middle East, and how you see the role of the Middle East going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dana, and thanks for having me with you this afternoon in Washington, this afternoon in Brussels, this morning in Washington. So as we can see more than ever today, security is interconnected. We can see that with lots of examples, North Korean soldiers in Kursk, that's probably the easiest one, but you also have Iranian drones being used by the Russians. You have the war in Ukraine created, as it was already said, food and energy insecurity that is creating social unrest, social turbulence, full migration, you name it. Or more recently, even the fall of the Assad regime that was clearly impacted and facilitated by Moscow's focus on its war in Ukraine, by the weakening of Hezbollah or Iran. From NATO's perspective, these challenges clearly underline the need to engage more with the South, to have a more 360 degrees approach, because we saw clearly that the different theaters were interconnected, and the importance of the South, and we call the South the Mediterranean region, the Middle East, the Gulf, and the Sahel, were impacting very much our security. Because of that approach, we decided already in Vilnius in 2023 to start a long reflection process that took us to approve a Southern Neighborhood Action Plan in the summit in Washington last summer. And immediately after that, I was appointed as special representative for the Southern Neighborhood. It's the first time that we have a special representative for the Southern Neighborhood. So it means a lot for us. It is a very ambitious approach, which we want to be more helpful for the Southern Neighborhood, contribute more to the stability of the region, and at the end of the day, the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. Already in 2022, when we approved the Madrid strategic concept that summer, a few months into the war, we already mentioned that the region was of strategic importance for us and was affecting Euro-Atlantic stability. But the events in the last couple of years that have been mentioned only have increased the interconnectivity of all those challenges. And one of the factors that has been for us a major element of this approach is the presence of geostrategic competitors all over the South, not just Russia, that is particularly relevant for us and has been a traditional trend in the organization I represent, but also China and Iran, as was mentioned by Riad in particular. From my perspective as special rep, what this situation highlights is actually the need to engage more and better and to cooperate more and better and in a more efficient manner with the Middle East and Africa to try to tackle together the shared security challenges. Actually, it is quite illustrative that it has been Ukraine itself that has decided to engage more and more with the southern neighborhood, which brings clearly in a country that wasn't that related with the South probably before, a sense of how global trends are relevant and how it is important to have a more global mind. Particularly when you deal with the UN, you understand how relevant is the G77. It was mentioned how the support has been fading away in some of the resolutions that were voted. The Ukrainian foreign minister, one of the very first ones to visit Damascus after the fall of Assad, which is very relevant in how things are connected. We at NATO have been consistently advocating support for Ukraine in our dialogue with our partners in the southern neighborhood. I have addressed this matter with most of my counterparts. And we understand very well, as Riad mentioned, that the war has put many countries around the world in a difficult position. I believe that right now, with the momentum towards negotiations that we are experiencing today, you mentioned, Dana, the meetings in Riyadh, and I think we were already for months in that dynamic, but now is actually being tangible. There is a real opportunity for the entire global community to contribute to peace. And we continue to encourage all UN members, and particularly in the South, to contribute to that by pressing Moscow, particularly the countries that have access to Moscow, to send the right message. The right message to us, and I do think that in this case it is what it is that the quickest way to put an end to the war is for the Russians to understand that the war has global consequences and is affecting particularly many of the countries that were traditionally partnering with Russia. I traveled to Mauritania a few weeks ago, or when you go to Algeria, or these are the countries that have been suffering the most during 3 years, apart, of course, from Ukraine. And the Russians need to understand that. But as Anna said, and I will end with that, how we end the war will matter for global security. If Russia ends up in a position where it feels it has won something from the war of aggression, Russia and other authoritarian actors will fuel further conflicts with all the consequences that we've seen. So the entire global community, in our opinion, has an interest in seeing a fair, a lasting, and a comprehensive peace in Ukraine and for Ukraine, where we should never forget, in our view, that one country was the aggressor, one country violated all rules that we all attach a lot of importance in the UN Charter and international law, and the other one was the victim.
Thank you so much for that. I'm struck by the comments of both you and Anna about Ukraine leading the way and engaging beyond Ukraine and beyond the European theater and engaging the southern neighborhood. And your very important observation up front that the takeaway from the past 3 years is that NATO needs to engage more. Very important points. And also what is quite clear is the cross-theater implications of this conflict, and what happens in one theater migrates to another theater, implications across a range of sectors and interests. With that, what I'd like to do is pose a few questions to our panelists and remind all of you participating today, either via the Zoom function on YouTube or on the Washington Institute website, that you are welcome to submit questions either through the Zoom Q&A function or by emailing policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum at washingtoninstitute.org. With that, what I'd like to do, since we spent the first part of this panel reflecting on the past 3 years, is talk about what has been a century of news in the past 3 days. So what we've seen is a rapidly changing U.S. approach under President Trump. President Trump had a long phone call with President Putin last week. Vice President J.D. Vance was in Europe giving remarks that have received significant attention at the Munich Security Conference, as well as a meeting with President Zelensky. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent traveled to Ukraine. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg was traveling across Europe for consultations. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth concluded his first trip to Europe and his first meeting with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. And then, of course, we have a team of top Trump administration officials meeting today with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Riyadh. Through all of this, the U.S. is signaling that NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table, that it wants this war to end, and that Ukraine should be flexible in terms of recovering its sovereign territory from Russian aggression. Riad, can I start with you? Can you share with us how these rapidly changing developments are being viewed across the Middle East, and are views shifting about the United States as its approach to this war and ending this war changes?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the major players in the region here, their whole political psychology towards the U.S. changed with the Trump administration returning to office. We all know the strong relations, especially between the countries in the Gulf, or the leaders in the Gulf countries and President Trump. And now we can see this being translated, on the ground in this form of Saudi Arabia hosting these talks. This is, I think, shows the benefits of using the soft power over the past few years. And we saw Saudi Arabia and UAE use their strong relations with both Ukraine and Russia, where they have maintained economic relations on both sides, as well as diplomatic relations, and they use those to facilitate prisoners exchanges. There's been several hundred prisoners on both sides, maybe thousands, released in the past 2-3 years because of the mediations led by either UAE or Saudi Arabia. This has, and also the success in maintaining a positive neutrality. It was not a neutrality of being negative, staying away from this whole thing. No, they were engaging, trying to play a positive role with both sides in a way to end this conflict. I think that qualified them to be accepted as being playing a role of a mediator, being the country that will host the conflict resolution efforts between the two powers. Again, another way of balancing and engaging successfully in the great power competition game through the eyes or the policies of the major players. I mean, Saudi Arabia today is the center of gravity in the Middle East. It's the main powerhouse of the Middle East, and it is a testimony for the success of their policies to host this. And again, President Trump is benefiting from this by giving Saudi Arabia this big prestigious role, which he's hoping to gain favors down the road with respect to his plans to the deal of a century and the Middle East peace process, plans for Gaza, and so forth. Again, we're seeing here that Ukraine Russia conflict getting intertwined with the Middle East many conflicts, and this is due to the fact that Russia does have interest here and used its relations in the Middle East in the war effort. And Ukraine was also successful in utilizing their economic relations, which they did not do successfully before. It's a country with rich with minerals and resources, but they never used them to build their soft power capability, but they learned to do so quickly, through their strong engagements through the foreign ministry over the past 3 years. And this has led to this situation that we see before us today, where we're seeing possibly the beginning of an agreement that will end this conflict, starting from or being shaped from these meetings in Riyadh. Now, as for the terms and the ideas about Ukraine not being allowed to join NATO or so forth, I don't think this is of much relevance, means too much to the countries of the region. For them, they know and they realize that Russia will not be withdrawing from many parts of Ukraine. They realize that this is a price Ukraine will have to eventually pay for. If I'm using some of the terms by commentators in the region, is that for failing to see the shortcomings and policies of the West, prior to the conflict. But again, this is the best way out from a perspective of neo-realists, which is a dominant way of thinking in the region.
Thank you so much. So Riad says, with respect to NATO membership for Ukraine, for the terms upon which this war ends and recovery of Ukrainian sovereign territory, doesn't matter much for countries of the Middle East. But what we can take away from the past days of developments is that governments across the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, feel vindicated in their position of neutrality over the past several years, and that the benefits of Middle East soft power have been underscored by the decision to host these initial talks in Saudi Arabia. Javier, if I could turn to you next to provide your perspective on all of the developments we've seen over the past couple of days and what the Trump administration appears to be signaling about the terms upon which this conflict may end.
Yeah, thank you. So we met with Hegseth last Thursday. I was myself in Munich from Friday and Saturday. SecGen met with Vance there. On Monday, we met with Kellogg. And yesterday evening, SecGen was in Paris during the meeting with Macron. So I think the US administration has been going back and forth with some of their proposals. I think it is a very fluid situation. Most of the messages that we have received indoors privately have been positive, very positive towards the alliance. They have all of them from President Trump when Mark Rutte went to Mar-a-Lago to the last meetings that I mentioned, have been showing their commitment to the alliance, more relevant than ever, they've said, most of them, even though then they have formulated some proposals for Ukraine and in terms of collective defense that sometimes were a bit disturbing for some of the allies. But privately with us, it's always been relatively positive. On Ukraine in particular, and we all heard, of course, Hegseth on last Wednesday, but then they said very clearly to us that nothing is off the table. Nothing, including membership, including borders, including I think that at the end, many of those things are probably not going to happen because of the dynamics of the negotiation. But what my allies wanted to hear mostly is that whatever happens, nothing is off the table permanently. One thing is to accept that negotiations could end up in whatever deal the Ukrainians might accept, and it is for the Ukrainians to decide on that. A completely different thing is to accept as part of the negotiation a permanent condition that affects either our collective defense or the fate of an independent country, as is the case of Ukraine. We were very clear in Washington about the irreversible path of Ukraine to membership. We stick to that. Then, as I said, I'm a diplomat and I understand real politics, so it will very much depend on how negotiations would evolve. But I want to be clear on what I said at the beginning. I know we hear lots of things. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of messaging going on coming from Washington. Many of the things that we are hearing, we don't like. Many of my allies don't like. Many southern nations wouldn't like. But I think it's not the end of the story. It's only been 30 days since the new administration took office. And I clearly sense that they're sort of using the communication to pass messages, to see reaction, to then adapt to the reaction, and then take it from there. I believe the fact that the negotiations have started with these 2 tracks in Riyadh with the Russians, Kellogg is now in Kiev, and they will start working on those 2 tracks and see how things evolve. We all, of course, are in favor of peace. As I said, it has to be a peace that takes into account that one of the 2 countries was an aggressor and the other one was a victim, that it has to take into account that the Ukrainians are independent and sovereign and need to take their own decisions. But at the end of the day, of course, peace should be good for everyone as long as you protect those principles. I do think, as I said before, that the process that we're going to witness in the next months has an impact in global affairs. I think it will have an impact globally at the UN, in the international scene in general. I think it will send a message on where we are. It will send a message on where the US is in global conflicts and challenges. And it will also send a message on what was the right thing to do. I think at this stage, in my view, is probably too early to establish that some of our partners, the ones that decided to be more neutral, understand this process as a backing of their positions. I think we'll see where we are in a few months. We've heard lots of proposals. For instance, one of them, Lindsey Graham, the US congressman, that said the other day that one possibility would be to have Article 5 in case the Russians break whatever deal is achieved in these negotiations. So I think everybody has high expectations, waiting and see. It's been already like that since the war started. I could sense very easily how countries were playing national interest, motivated foreign policy, looking at how the war was evolving, positioning themselves with one foot in every camp, just to say. And I think that's a fine foreign policy and security policy option, as long as it plays out in terms of stability, it plays out in terms of security and peace, and that's what we want to see in general, NATO, the UN, and all of us. We should take every opportunity that we have to engage with our southern counterparts and to take the best of every occasion. Of course, the Saudis should play a role, and I do agree with Riad that it's a deliberate decision by President Trump. We know that the Saudis have leverage in Washington for many reasons, from energy to the possibility of normalizing their relations with Israel if there is a deal on the Palestinian that is acceptable for the Palestinian people. But I do believe there is a moment, as I said, to listen hard, but to be cautious in the way we draw lessons.
Thank you so much. So, in short summary, there's the public conversation and the messaging and the private discussions. And those of us out in the open discussion need to be aware that there are actually openness to flexibility, and that a key message from NATO is that Ukraine must be represented in these negotiations. Collective defense of Europe is not something to be negotiated, that there are actually two tracks here. There's what Secretary Rubio and the team is doing in Riyadh, and then what Special Envoy Keith Kellogg is doing in Europe and Ukraine. And then finally, yes, there is alignment on the need for ending this war and a pursuit of peace. But it must acknowledge that one country is the aggressor here and the other is the victim. I'm going to turn to Anna now to add her remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dana. I'd like to build on the points that Riad and Javier have made. And again, as Dana mentioned, it's very important to keep in mind that there are two tracks here, the public messaging and the private discussion. As far as the public discussion is concerned, we had talked in the beginning about the importance of how this war is going to end and the message that the ending of this war will send. Building on the point about recognizing that Russia was the aggressor and that Ukraine was the victim, and that European security is non-negotiable, that Ukrainians have a right to say in their future. It's important to talk about what this victory would look like, what this outcome would look like. Throughout the course of this war, there's been so much discussion about what does it mean for Russia to win and for Ukraine to lose. The fact of the matter is, nobody could fully agree on what that victory would look like. But I think what's important as a starting point is to recognize that without security guarantees for Ukraine, without some sort of assurance that Russia will not attack Ukraine again, and without demonstrating that Russia paid a heavy price for its war of aggression, it would be impossible to have a conversation of ending this war in the way that we had discussed here, in the way that we've outlined here, in a way that shows that the liberal world order matters, that Russia's alternative vision is a losing one, and in a way that sends a message, as Javier mentioned earlier, to other authoritarians that this way of behaving will not work in this international system. And I think that is an inseparable part of both public, should be both public and private discussions. What I think is very important here is also the economic interests of the region that Riad has mentioned, and this dovetails on the idea of what this end game would look like, right? The Soviet Union fell apart for many reasons, but a key contributing factor was the fact that Saudi Arabia has significantly increased its oil output to drive down oil prices, which significantly dwindles the Soviet Union's resources. And the problem that we faced here right now with this war in Ukraine is that the West could not isolate Russia globally. Russia continued to find resources to fight the war, and oil prices were a big part of it. We're in a different world now. We're not in a Cold War. And so this question of what's going to happen to oil prices, what's going to happen to other Russian and regions' economic interests, I think is going to be an important, very important part of the discussion of how this war is going to end in a way that sends the right message, that Russia was the aggressor, Ukraine was the victim.
Anna makes important comments about the theory of victory and what a just settlement might look like in this case. She lays out security guarantees for Ukraine and a clear demonstration that Russia suffered costs because of its unprovoked acts of aggression in Ukraine in a way that sends messages to future would-be aggressors. Here gets back to a point we've heard from all three panelists about the cross-theater implications. What's happening in Europe has affected the Middle East. What's happening in the Middle East has affected both Europe and other theaters. She also talks about why the West was unable to completely isolate Russia, and that economic considerations must be part of considerations for how and on what terms this war ends. I'm going to turn to another question that I think is a really significant one and an outgrowth of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is, and Riad mentioned this in his opening remarks, Russia's growing dependence on Iran and the deepening military and technological exchange between Tehran and Moscow. But also, as Javier mentioned, Beijing and Pyongyang have also deepened ties to Moscow and Tehran in what some here in Washington call the axis of upheaval. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share thoughts on this axis of cooperation and what risks it poses to the Middle East. I'll start with Anna, then to Javier, and then to Riad.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dana. Well, as Riad had mentioned in his earlier remarks, Russia and Iran are now on their back foot in the region. Russia failed to save Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Iran and its proxies have suffered a major military setback in the region. And that is an important part of this new reality that we're living in today, one which the West should take full advantage of. Having said that, Russia and Iran have developed relations on multiple other fronts outside of Syria. Most noteworthy, perhaps, is that the two countries have signed a strategic partnership just last month, which discusses, amongst other things, strategic cooperation on defense. China, for its part, along with North Korea, have both actively enabled Russia's war in Ukraine. In fact, we had seen in the backdrop of President Trump's discussion of a peace settlement, he didn't necessarily directly talk about it, but China looms in the background of these discussions, including the discussion of Ukraine's natural resources. The fact of the matter is, Russia controls a large portion of Ukrainian territory that contains these natural resources, and China implicitly has access to them. And that is a really big backdrop of not only what's happening now, but what is driving the future of these discussions and how this war is going to progress and how a potential peace settlement is going to progress.
Javier, can I turn to you next?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I agree. I think the fall of Assad clearly put Russia and Iran in a difficult position, in my view, more Iran than Russia, that has more levers probably to get back than Iran. I think this axis of evil that we mentioned, or upheaval, is a big concern for all of us. We are particularly concerned, I would say, with China's role in the war in Ukraine. We think it was the decisive enabler for the war. It's true that it was the North Koreans and the Iranians that supported with direct military support Russia, but it wasn't that substantial. Probably the Iranian drones played a role. We don't think military, the North Koreans played a real role with soldiers, but they've been sustaining the military effort. Yes, that is true. But at the end of the day, what was particularly problematic, one could see why the Russians would sign a strategic partnership with Iran. There's lots of reasons to do that, not just the war in Ukraine, the nuclear power, the know-how, even the dynamics of their own foreign policies. It could easily make sense. But for us, clearly what is a bigger concern is to have a P5, a responsible, a country that should be a responsible global power, playing a role that was at least dubious. And that's the case of China. And we've been saying we have an engagement track with China. We talk a lot with them. We're very transparent with them. And we have told them since the war started that we were extremely disappointed, that we were expecting more of a country that has been championing the UN Charter forever. And then how was it possible then when probably the most flagrant violation of the UN Charter in decades happened, they couldn't take a stand in defending the UN Charter. And I think it's obvious that China should play a role in global affairs, can play a role in defense and security and foreign policy, is the second largest power in Earth, and that's why it is more of a concern to us than any of the others. But at the end is the alignment of these forces that creates lots of problems for all of us. We'll see where we are with these negotiations. We've heard also lots of things from Washington with regard particularly to Russia. That's why as I said before, even though you cannot draw conclusions, but I do believe that whatever happens in the war in Ukraine would have a strong impact in the Middle East. It would have a strong impact on how Russia behaves with Iran, how Iran behaves with the world, how the US behaves with Iran. So there's lots of connections there. And in a few months, I think we will be able to see with clarity where we are. But indeed, it is a very concerning trend already for a few years.
Thank you. Riad.
Well, I think the Russians have lost a lot of credibility in Iran because of what happened in Syria. And we've heard, and we saw the comments made by Iranian Revolutionary Guards generals after their exit from Syria, blaming Russia for their lack of military support that led to the eventual downfall of the regime. And I believe the Russians eventually had to proceed with signing the strategic agreement, which Iran has been seeking for a few years. And they've done so as a way to, try to make up to mend the relations between them. But Russia also has a problem in giving Iran what it wants, because Russia wants itself to balance its relations with the Gulf countries, has a lot of interest. As Anna mentioned, the Russians realize that if the Saudis decide to raise the output, they are in trouble. The oil prices would actually go down. That Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries can play a very damaging role with respect to oil prices if they decide to. And that's why Russia did not, and I don't think it will ever provide Tehran with all its wishes, especially in the providing like very advanced air defense systems, advanced fighters, and technological capabilities that they want. That is, on that side. On the other side, we have the issue of the outcome of these negotiations, the outcome of this war, especially if you put it in the perspective and the same context of the statements we heard from President Trump with regards to Greenland, to Panama, and so forth. And this has caused a stir in the media here, amongst commentators, questioning whether we are witnessing the end of liberalism as we saw after World War II, and the return to imperialism, where we see the main powers, the major powers, doing land grabs. So Russia seems to be this war is gonna end with Russia keeping what it has taken in territory from Ukraine, and if that is followed by the U.S. gaining territory either in Greenland or I don't know where, and you add to this, what is being said about driving Gazans out of their land, and turning Gaza into a Riviera or whatever. And also is feeding to this fear rhetoric of the return to imperialism, that we're seeing the end of the liberal democracies as were born ever since the end of World War II, and how this is going to impact the region. So that's why it's very important to see the final outcome of the Ukraine Russian negotiations, how this war is going to end, what Ukraine is going to get, what sort of securities will get, and also what will be Russia's gains, and how the US will present this outcome, whether it's going to show it as a victory and a gain for Russia, and further talk of a US seeking more territory. It will be, for many, and remember, Middle East is a land of conspiracy theories, and this will definitely undermine the trust in the Western liberal democracies for the for the next few years.
Thank you. I think this is such an important point that we've heard in variations from all three of our panelists, is that what happens with respect to Russia, Ukraine is not in isolation, but happening across theaters with so many implications. And for example, statements coming from the Trump administration about Greenland, about Panama, about Gaza, actually shape narratives and perspectives on what an acceptable outcome with respect to Russia, Ukraine would be, because there are now questions about the US approach to the post-World War II international order. So we've heard from each of our panelists a little bit about what a settlement might look like. Javier has been very clear with us that we're in an early stages here. We must wait several months, see how these things evolve, not rush to judgment. Anna offered a theory of victory, of what it might look like for Ukraine to either win or lose. I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes of today's discussion asking each of our panelists to reflect on this exact thing, the outcome of this war, and specifically how it might fuel either appetite for more cooperation and deepening relationships with the West or not. So Riad talked about perceptions of victory or defeat in the Middle East, but I'd like to just ask you one more time, what does winning or losing look like for Ukraine, or winning or losing look like for Russia? And based on what that looks like, how will it shift perspectives across the Middle East? Then to Javier, and finally to Anna to bring us home. Riad, over to you.
Well, you have here the dilemma of desires and realities, and if Ukraine was to face the facts on the ground, the desire to have a full liberation of Ukrainian territory seems far-fetched at the moment. So the question here, what would be fair for Ukraine? What is the scenario under which Ukraine would have to give up its sovereign territory, part of its sovereign territory? Is it going to be in the form of there will be somewhat going to hold some referendums? Are they going to be just merely giving up this territory? In return, also, what guarantees they're going to get that there will be no further or future acts of aggression by Russia? So what security guarantees will they get for the future? This is something very important. It's the narrative. What is the narrative that will be acceptable for the Ukrainians and finishing this, and also that would be acceptable globally, especially here in the Middle East? In the Middle East, they would like to hear that Russia has or Ukraine has decided to reach a compromise to end this conflict with assurances that it will not face any further aggression in the future. and it will have its security guarantees. Also, what will it mean for the future of Europe? Is Russia going to feel safe? Will not feel threatened by any European measures. We will not see a continued rise of conflict in Europe. Will this bring an end to a conflict in Europe? Because this will definitely have a long-lasting impact, at least or especially economically, on the region.
Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, the official line we have is the one that is well known. But if we go into real politics and what might happen in the negotiation, the question is not what is fair for Ukraine, because what is fair for Ukraine would be sovereignty and territorial integrity, but what is fair and possible for Ukraine. And there, I think that the US and all Europeans know and are convinced that the Ukrainians need to be the ones deciding on that. At the end, whatever is the deal we end up will have, in my view, enormous impact worldwide. It will have an impact on the US stance. It will have an impact on the Europeans at large capacity, because it will show our ability to get together, our ability to be able to push for a decent deal that respects the main principles of the Ukrainian position, of course, taking into account all realpolitik considerations, of course, but the main principles of its position, that will be able to provide the security guarantees that indeed will need any agreement, and that is something that Europeans are already working on, and that the US has been clear on the things they would do and the things they wouldn't do. I think at the end, it would be important that we remain united, that we show to the world that we are able to work together and to provide a long-lasting, comprehensive and fair, even if possible, peace agreement for Ukraine. I think in how we resolve with a long-lasting effort this problem, there will be also lessons to be learned for how we end up resolving the problem in the Middle East. So I think there is indeed connections. The US is too much of a super global power still. And the way we're able to manage the US positions, the first public communications by President Trump, but how it ends up, how we accompany the process, how we reorient the whole approach will have definitely an impact in many other aspects of international relations, and I believe particularly in the Middle East. And I would add to that point that actually the fact that the League of Arab States is meeting at the heads of state level at the end of this month in Cairo, the fact that the Arabs are already talking about money, about financing, about reconstructing, about soldiers, is already an impact on how the new US administration is acting with regard to the peace negotiations in Ukraine.
Thank you. Anna.
Sure. I'd like to summarize and build on Riad's and Javier's comments here to wrap up this very important discussion. What struck me in Riad's comments were 3 points. One, as Riad had said, Russia's credibility in the Middle East has suffered as a result of Assad's fall in Syria. But two, that President Trump's comments about Greenland and so forth have also raised questions about imperialism and about how America is behaving on the global stage. And finally, as we discussed the potential end of this conflict in Ukraine, will Russia feel safe? And this ties to the issue of narratives. The fact of the matter is, I think it's really important that Riad, that you made this comment, because it highlights, I think, the resilience of competing narratives that underpin this war. The fact of the matter is, Russia was under no threat. Russia was under no attack from NATO or the West. If anything, the West has done its utmost to bring Russia into the fold with the end of the Cold War. If anything, there was a special Russian NATO council set up, and Russia was a part of it. And it was only expelled from it after Russia illegally annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. So, but the fact that there's such a widespread perception that somehow Russia didn't feel safe, that maybe Russia had a point in, even if it was Russia was wrong to use force, there was something that we need to consider in Russia's narrative on this war. I think is very important, is a very important point of discussion, because the fact of the matter is it's simply not the case. That was not the reality. Russia was not under any threat. If anything, it was Russia that was threatening its neighbors. And with that, I think also to tie some of Javier's comments about what is fair and what is possible, I'd like to conclude by saying that we are in a very uncertain time. We're talking about waiting a few months to see how these negotiations are going to play out. Everything is on the table. But the way in which this war is going to end will impact the world in which we live. And the very foundation of our order, of our liberal world order, is on the line. American credibility is on the line. If this war ends in a way that sends the wrong message, the message that it is okay to act with impunity in a privileged sphere of influence, this will reverberate certainly across the Middle East. It will certainly impact American credibility in the Middle East with its partners. And as Dana, as you had mentioned before, it raises the question about what is realistic in a war of a global scale as such. What do partners, for example, like our partners in the Middle East, what is realistically possible for them? And is neutrality perhaps a safer option?
Thank you so much for those concluding remarks from all of you. And thank you so much. I thought this was an incredibly important, rich discussion at a critical moment for two theaters. But as everyone on this panel has agreed, two theaters with global impact and, of course, very serious impact on the Middle East and North Africa, and the potential for future cooperation with these critical leaders, peoples, and governments. I want to thank all of you who tuned in today on the Zoom, on YouTube, on our website. If you liked what you heard, I encourage you to check out the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Sign up for our press releases. Anna is a preeminent expert on Russia and Ukraine, and specifically the impact on the Middle East. We have expertise on everything here at the Washington Institute. We do our best to have timely policy forums like this, as well as our scholars putting out constant written pieces and other public events to frame the magnitude and the policy implications and the risks and the opportunities of what you're reading in the news and what it has for this critical region that we care about so much. So thank you again for participating and tuning in. Thank you again to our panel, and look forward to seeing all of you next time.